This week, we're going to look at the two most significant objections to Descartes, the Cartesian circle and the mind-body problem. The Cartesian circle is an epistemological objection that comes up in Meditation 5, and the mind-body problem is a metaphysical objection that comes up in Meditation 6. What we've seen so far is that in Meditation 1, Descartes calls into doubt all of our beliefs, specifically all of our beliefs based on sense perception. In Meditation 2, Descartes establishes with certainty the beliefs that I exist and that I am a thinking thing. In Meditation 3, Descartes proves that God exists and that God created our minds in order to show that our certain beliefs are likely to be true beliefs. Descartes sums up in the final paragraph of Meditation 5, "Thus I see plainly that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends uniquely on my awareness of the true God to such an extent that I was incapable of perfect knowledge about anything else until I became aware of him." Descartes' correspondent, Mersenne, reacts strongly to this passage. On page 102, Mersenne writes, "You are not yet certain of the existence of God, and you say that you are not yet certain of anything, and cannot know anything clearly and distinctly until you have achieved clear and certain knowledge of the existence of God. It follows from this that you did not yet clearly and distinctly know that you are a thinking thing in Meditation 2, since, on your own admission, that knowledge depends on the clear knowledge of an existing God. And this you have not yet proved in the passage from Meditation 2, where you draw the conclusion that you clearly know what you are." So the worry Mersenne raises in this passage is that it would seem, from Descartes' claim in Meditation 5, that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends on our knowledge of God, that Descartes' results in Meditation 2, that I am and that I'm a thinking thing, didn't amount to knowledge, or indeed weren't certain, since, at that point in Meditation 2, Descartes had not yet proved God exists, and hence did not yet prove that God created our minds. Now, perhaps this is surprising. It might have seemed that we had knowledge that I am and that I am a thinking thing in Meditation 2, before the proof of the existence of God. But perhaps Descartes can respond to Mersenne here by saying that these beliefs were certain, yet didn't amount to knowledge until the proof for God's existence in Meditation 3, and that only after that proof did the beliefs from Meditation 2 amount to knowledge. What would be problematic, however, indeed circular, is if Descartes relied on the results of Meditation 2 in Meditation 3, but that the results of Meditation 2 somehow depended on the results of Meditation 3. That is, the circular problem for Descartes would arise if the proof for God's existence depended on my prior knowledge that I think and that I'm a thinking thing, and yet my knowledge that I think and that I'm a thinking thing also relied on my proof for God's existence. Now, if we look back at the proof for God's existence, it's not obvious that this proof relies on the prior knowledge that I am, or that I'm a thinking thing. These are not premises in the proof for God's existence, after all. The premises were that I have an idea of God innate in my mind, and that the objective reality in any idea must be caused by something with at least as much formal reality. Maybe the first premise, that innate in my mind I have an idea of God, depends on my prior knowledge that I exist, or that I'm a thinking thing. And if it does, Descartes' argument would indeed be circular. I think this is debatable. But there's a second version of the Cartesian circle objection that the philosopher Antoine Arnauld raises. This is on page 106 of our text. Arnauld writes, "I have one further worry, namely how the author avoids reasoning in a circle when he says that we are sure that what we clearly and distinctly perceive is true only because God exists. But we can be sure that God exists only because we clearly and distinctly perceive this. Hence, before we can be sure that God exists, we ought to be able to be sure that whatever we perceive clearly and distinctly is true." So the circularity that Arnauld is concerned about here isn't between the proof of God's existence and the knowledge that I am and I am a thinking thing. Instead, the circularity is between the proof of God's existence and our certain beliefs being true. Now, what Arnauld says in his objection is that we prove God's existence by clearly and distinctly perceiving this. And that's not exactly right. The proof for God's existence didn't go, I clearly and distinctly perceive that God exists, therefore God exists. Again, the way that proof went was premise 1, innate in my mind I have an idea of God, and premise 2, the objective reality in any idea must causally derive from something with at least as much formal reality. But now, ask, how were these premises established? Descartes claims that his distinction between innate, adventitious, and invented ideas, and indeed his causal principle as well, is revealed to him by the natural light, and that whatever is revealed by the natural light cannot in any way be open to doubt. So the worry that I think Arnaud's objection points us toward is that Descartes establishes both premises in his proof for God's existence by showing that these premises cannot be doubted. In other words, by showing that these premises are certain. But now, the question is that good enough? Do we want the premises for the proof of God's existence to be certain, or do we want them to be true? If the premises in the proof of God's existence need to be true, and all Descartes' shown is that these premises cannot be doubted and hence are certain, then it would seem Descartes is relying on certain beliefs being true in establishing the premises for the proofs of God's existence. And yet, it's the proof of God's existence that's meant to show us that our certain beliefs are likely to be true. So if this were the case, then we'd have a real circularity problem. Descartes would be relying on certain beliefs being true in order to establish the premises in the proof of God's existence. But Descartes has a right to rely on certain beliefs being true only once he's established the conclusion of the proof of God's existence. One way Descartes might try to get out of this problem is by allowing the premises in his proof of God's existence are certain, though perhaps not true. Descartes might try to say that the proof of God's existence is a simple intuition of the mind, where the premises need to be certain rather than true, and that they show that the conclusion is certain. But I don't think this is going to work, because what do we need to establish that certain beliefs are likely to be true? Do we need to be certain that God exists? Or does it need to be true that God exists? If it needs to be true that God exists, in order for us to have a reason to believe that certain beliefs are true, then it's not enough for the proof of God's existence to establish the certainty that God exists. It would need to establish the truth of God's existence. And it would seem that in order to establish the truth of God's existence, the premises in the argument for God's existence would have to be true, not simply certain. Okay, so this is the Cartesian circle objection. The basic idea is, what comes first? The proof of God's existence, or the knowledge of I think and I am? Or what comes first? The proof of God's existence, or the knowledge that certain beliefs are true? Now, if you choose to write your essay on the Cartesian circle this week, what you should do is state what you think the strongest version of the Cartesian circle objection is. Imagine how Descartes might best reply to this objection, and consider whether you think his reply is satisfactory. The other objection we're going to consider this week is the mind-body problem. And this comes up after Descartes' proof of the real distinction between the mind and the body, and after Descartes' proof of the existence of the external world. So let's look at these proofs. First, we need to know what Descartes means by really distinct. Descartes' drawing what's called the doctrine of distinctions. According to the doctrine of distinctions, there's three different kinds of distinction: a notional distinction, a modal distinction, and a real distinction. Here's what these terms mean. X and Y are notionally distinct, means that X depends for its existence on Y, and Y also depends for its existence on X. In other words, two things are notionally distinct if each can't exist without the other. Examples are Ceylon and Sri Lanka, Clark Kent and Superman, and salt and sodium chloride. Right, the thought here is that Clark Kent and Superman are notionally distinct because if you kill off Clark Kent, Superman dies too. And if you kill Superman, Clark Kent is dead. If there's two names for the same thing, then those two names are notionally distinct. X and Y are modally distinct, means that X depends for its existence on Y, while Y can exist independently of X. An example here that came up last time is my fist in my hand. Another example is the state of Alaska and the United States of America. The thought is, the United States could exist without Alaska being a state, right? There was a time when the United States existed, and Alaska was not a state. But there cannot be a state of Alaska without there being the United States. Of course, there could be a landmass off the northwest coast of Canada without there being a United States. But there cannot be a state of Alaska without there being the United States. So in that sense, the state of Alaska is modally distinct from the United States. Now, the third sort of distinction is a real distinction. X and Y are really distinct, means that X and Y can exist independently of each other. So examples here are me and you, or sugar and salt. If you eliminated all the sugar, the salt could still exist. And if you eliminated all the salt, there could still be sugar. So in this sense, salt and sugar are independent substances. They are really distinct substances. What Descartes wants to argue is that the mind and the body are really distinct substances, just like sugar and salt. Each could exist independently of the other. Mind could be annihilated, and the body could persist, and just the same, the body could die, and the mind could still exist. Descartes' proof of this is on page 54. The first premise is that because certainty yields truth, if I can be certain of X without thinking of Y, and if I can be certain of Y without thinking of X, then X can exist without Y, and Y can exist without X. Premise 2 is that in meditation 2, I attained certainty of my mind while doubting the existence of my body, and indeed all other bodies. Premise 3 is that in geometry, I attained certainty of extended things, that is, bodies, without thinking of any minds. The conclusion is that mind and body can exist independently of each other, and hence are really distinct. This argument doesn't yet show that there is an external world, or that there are actually bodies. Descartes' proof of the external world is on the next page, 55. The first premise in this proof is that my mind receives ideas of bodies outside me from sense perception. Premise 2 is that God created my mind and is no deceiver. The third premise is that if God created my mind with a faculty of sense perception, whereby I receive ideas of bodies outside me, and yet there were no bodies outside me whatsoever, then God would be a deceiver. The conclusion is that there really are bodies outside me, ideas of which I receive through sense perception. It doesn't follow from this argument that the external world is laid out exactly as it appears to me. What the argument does purport to establish is that there is an external world, something that Descartes called into question in Meditation 1. Now, mind-body problem first comes up in a correspondence of letters between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. Elizabeth brings up the problem of mind-body interaction. She writes, "I ask you to tell me how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions. For it seems that all determination of movement happens through the impulsion of the thing moved, by the manner in which it is pushed, by that which moves it, or else by the particular qualities of shape of the surface of the latter. Physical contact is required for the first two conditions, extension for the third. You entirely exclude the one, extension, from the notion you have of the soul, and the other, physical contact, appears to me incompatible with an immaterial thing." So the case of mind-body interaction that Elizabeth brings up is voluntary action. It would seem that when I decide to raise my hand, and then my hand goes up, we have a case of something happening in the mind, a decision to raise my hand, causing something to happen in my body, my hand going up. Elizabeth asks how this is possible if the mind and the body are really distinct. Another case of mind-body interaction would be acquiring ideas through sense perception. It would seem that in sense perception, there are material bodies that affect our sense organs, and that these effects on our sense organs cause ideas in our minds. So the question can be raised here too, how there can be a causal chain that proceeds from material things to ideas in the mind, given that there's a real distinction between mind and body. Elizabeth goes on to give two sorts of reasons for thinking that there couldn't be a causal chain proceeding from mind to body or from body to mind. The first is that causal interaction requires physical contact. If causation required physical contact, then it would seem impossible for there to be mind-body interaction, according to Descartes, since ideas are not physical and so couldn't come into physical contact with bodies. In Descartes' reply to Elizabeth, he challenges Elizabeth's assumption that causal interaction requires physical contact by bringing up the case of gravity. But Descartes fails to address Elizabeth's second reason for thinking that there couldn't be causal interaction between mind and body. The second reason is that in order for two things to stand in causal relations, both things must have properties of extension, and yet ideas have no properties of extension, according to Descartes. I think it's obvious that in this case, gravity is no counterexample to Elizabeth. In fact, gravity supports Elizabeth's point. In order for two bodies to exert gravitational force upon each other, those bodies must have mass and be some distance apart from one another. But if ideas are non-extended, as they are according to Descartes, then it would seem that ideas can't be any distance from physical bodies. And so, ideas can't stand in gravitational relations with physical bodies. And the thought generally for Elizabeth would be that if ideas lack any properties of extension, then they can't enter into causal interactions with physical bodies, either in the case of intentional action nor perception. A final version of the mind-body problem comes up in the text of the Meditations itself. While the versions of the mind-body problem raised by Elizabeth concerned mind-body interaction, this final version concerns mind-body unity. On page 56, Descartes himself writes, "Nature teaches me, by the sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that I am not merely present in my body, as a sailor is present in a ship, but that I am very closely joined and, as it were, intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit." The worry is that while Descartes says this, he has no right to say it. How can the mind and the body be joined or intermingled if they're really distinct? More specifically, if the mind is non-extended, and if I am my thinking mind, then how could it be that I am sitting? It would seem that to be sitting is to be extended in a particular sort of way. But if I am my mind, and my mind is non-extended, then it would seem that I cannot be sitting. It would seem that, strictly speaking for Descartes, my body is sitting, while I am simply thinking. Now, as it's clear from the text, Descartes wants to resist this result. He wants to find a way to say, I am sitting, or I am hungry, or I am in pain. But the worry is that Descartes has no right to say these sorts of things, given the real distinction between mind and body. So again, your paper could either take on the Cartesian circle objection, or some version, or all the versions, of the mind-body problem. In the case of the mind-body problem, you again want to frame what you think is the most persuasive version of this objection, present what you think is Descartes' most compelling avenue of reply, and you want to consider whether you think this reply is satisfactory. In the case of the mind-body problem in particular, if you think this problem is insoluble, you should look back at the arguments that Descartes gave for the real distinction between the mind and the body, and for the existence of the body, and consider where Descartes went wrong in these arguments. If you think the mind and the body are not really distinct, what sort of distinction do you think obtains? Modal distinction? A notional distinction? No distinction at all? If you think something less than a real distinction holds between the mind and the body, tell me how Descartes' argument for the real distinction went wrong, and what argument you would give for the distinction that you're proposing.